today we want to talk about how to not run out of money in retirement and protect yourself against inflation. And wait till the end. We've got a very super interesting fact you probably haven't heard before that'll help you out. So, Neil, what do you have to tell our viewers about not running out of money?
You know, conventional wisdom has always been that, and most people think that if they want to invest for retirement income, they need bonds or trustees or anything that's going to give them a monthly income. And that's a rational approach. It makes sense, and that's what everyone's been taught. But I think that many people shortchange themselves because equities can provide actually potentially a much better solution for retirement income. In fact, my position is equity is the only way to inflation-proof your retirement income so you don't run out of money. What do you think about that, Larry?
Well, you know, that makes good sense. And actually, there's some evidence about this. And, you know, I should probably share with people the Trinity study, which, and some of you may not have heard of the Trinity study, but you may have heard of the 4% rule. And so let me explain where that comes from, and that'll help explain Neil's comment about why you've got to have equities. So the Trinity study, a group of professors sat down and asked themselves this question: how do you invest so that your money will last for your entire retirement and you won't run out of money? And how can you at the same time give yourself an inflation adjusted income so that each year you can take a little more from your portfolio so that you can pay for your inflated expenses? And so what they found was as follows, and let me see if I can pull
up.
Wait
a second. Let me just interrupt for a minute here. Sorry, Larry.
Yeah.
They looked. It's important for everyone to understand. They looked at the periods at various time periods, but what we're going to talk about is the 30-year time periods from 1926 to 1956 to 1927 to 1957. By the way, great year because I was born that year. 28 to 58 and so forth. Then they looked at, I don't know how many periods through 1995. And they looked at various portfolios, you know, allocated. And they looked at someone taking out 4% and then adjusting their withdrawal rate for inflation. And then they tried to determine which scenario was most likely to work. Study?
Yeah, and I think if I show this table, it'll make more sense. All right, good. So what we have here is some columns where the professors said, okay, what if somebody had 100% in stocks? Or what if they had 75% stocks, 25% bonds, or 50% stocks, 50% bonds, etc. So they showed different types of portfolios. And in this table, we're only going to show the results over 30 years, even though they looked at what happens over 15, 20, 25, all the way up to a 40-year time frame, assuming, say, somebody retired at 65 and lived for another 40 years. But right now, we'll just use 30 years as a typical time that people spend in retirement. And so what we find is that, for example, when somebody has a 75% in stocks and 25% bonds, that if they took out 4% a year, they had 100% chance that that portfolio would have lasted for a 30-year time frame and not run out of money. And so,
but that only means that in the period that they studied, nobody blew up. But it doesn't mean that it's a guarantee of the future, right?
That's exactly right. And so, in fact, so one of the things anybody should understand is, even though this study looked at every period from 1925 to 1995, and by the way, it was further updated. Somebody else did another extension of this and pretty much found the same results when updating this through 2018, that a 4% was a safe withdrawal rate. But the thing that is not taken into account would be an extended period of years when the stock market had bad performance. So let me say this a little more clearly. This period that they studied, 1925 to 1995, did take into account the Great Depression during the 30s. So these numbers account for that. But what if we had a period that was worse? It doesn't account for the possibility that the future does not look like the past. And when anybody looks at any investment performance, they always have to keep that in mind. The future could be different.
Even if the stock market does well, but if inflation is much worse than expected, how would that impact it? That might also endanger the results, correct?
There's no doubt about it. Now, the good news is, and I think we have a chart. Let me just see if I have it handy. Well, we'll be able to show this. You can see the long run relationship between how stocks performed and how inflation performed. And we see that there's a pretty big margin over time, meaning that the stock market performance has outpaced inflation. Again, that's not always true. In other words, in the early 80s, when inflation was running double digits, 12%, 13, 14, 15%, inflation was actually higher for a short time, was a greater percentage than how the stock market performed. So that is always also a concern, unlikely, but a concern.
Right, especially because in this strategy of taking, we're going to say 4% plus inflation, if inflation is very high, let's say you have a 7% inflation, so you got 4% base, 7% inflation, that's 11%. If you only return 6%, you're eating into your capital. You're going backwards, right?
There's no doubt about it. And I should also caution people, the published inflation rate that you see by the government may not be your personal inflation rate.
Wait a second. You mean the government doesn't always tell us the truth about inflation? Or is that what I'm hearing?
I'm not saying that they don't tell you the truth. Here's what I'm saying. That when they calculate the rate of inflation, they're looking at an increase in people's housing costs, as well as food and everything else. But in my example, my housing costs went down over the last 6 months. Why? Because I refinanced my mortgage from, I think, 3 5/8 to 2 3/4. So my mortgage payment's smaller now than it was a year ago. And so my personal inflation rate is different than what the government is saying, because I'm not exposed to the same things. In fact, my expenses, the only inflation we've seen is when we go to the supermarket. And fortunately, food is a pretty small part of my overall budget. So all I'm saying is
Crusader wear is getting more expensive, Larry. Crusader wear, very expensive.
It's true. So all I'm saying is people should keep in mind that don't always listen to what you read in the paper, see in the news about inflation. Your personal inflation rate is what's really of concern, and yours could be greater or less than what you're reading.
What are the conclusions of the study? You may have already said it, but maybe you can summarize that again.
Yeah, so the conclusions of the study were simply this, that take a typical retiree who's going to spend 30 years in retirement, that if they have a portfolio of 75% stocks, 25% bonds, that portfolio, and if they withdraw 4% a year, and when I say 4% a year, so if they start with $1 million, they would take 40,000 the first year. The next year, they're going to take 40,000 plus the inflation for that year, and they're going to increase it each year. That if they did that, the study says over a 30-year period, they would not exhaust their portfolio. They would still have a considerable amount left.
What's interesting there is that as investors became more conservative, the risks actually went up. In other words, the survivability of a portfolio at 4% plus inflation, the survivability decreases as you get more conservative because of inflation.
Right. So what's counterintuitive and what most retirees, or a lot of retirees, I think, don't realize is this. They have in their mind this idea that in retirement, you'll protect your assets better if you're more conservative. The study showed exactly the opposite, which we know to be true, which is if somebody went from a 75% stock to portfolio down to a 50, only had 50% in stocks, their risk actually went up by holding fewer stocks.
Right.
So the point that people sometimes miss is that over the long run, stocks will give them less risk during their retirement years. It's only over the short run do people think stocks are more risky because of that year-to-year volatility. So
Right.
being more conservative actually hurts you in the long run. In fact,
Now,
here's a strange thing. Really, really wealthy people can afford to be very conservative because they'll never exhaust their money, even if they only make 3% a year on their money. It's
right.
everybody else that needs to understand why they have to have equity.
We always stress the importance of, taking this idea, and it's a strong idea. We both use it, but not to run out and necessarily implement, but to talk with your own financial advisor before you take action. And there are risks. It's not a guarantee. In the study that we saw by the Trinity study, there was 100% survivability, but it's very possible that in the next time they redo these studies, it may not work. For example, if you look at this from 2000 to 2000, I guess that would be 30. We're not done with that period yet. Who knows? But we went through a horrific, I think the worst decade ever for stocks. And right now we're in a period of high inflation. So you need to talk to your own advisor before taking action, and to realize that there are risks.
There's actually two other things I want to add to that. One of the biggest interrupters of people's financial performance in their retirement years is their own emotions. And one of the problems with the Trinity study is that it still exposes you to that year-to-year volatility when people can get nervous. So in another video we talk about the bucket strategy, which helps insulate the emotional reaction to these year-to-year changes. So be sure and take a look at that. And then the other thing I want to mention, which is really, really important, is people's spending tends to go down as they age. And that has implications on how you use your money in retirement. And we're saving another entire video to deal with that issue and illustrate that for you, of how to spend money in retirement based on the fact that you'll spend less money at 70 than at 60, and less money at 80 than at 70, and less money, etc., as you get older.
The best way to know about that is to subscribe below and hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when that new video is released. And we hope you continue to join us on our crusade for retirement income security.
Coming at you next time. See you soon.